Hello, today we are going to be diving into the wizarding world of Harry Potter, and more specifically, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, with my own personal commentary along with it. I was thinking about just doing a reading, and personally, I feel like there's so many amazing audiobooks to choose from that the best thing I could do is just add a little bit of a personal flair to it. Um, and hopefully, it's alluring enough for the masses to stick around. And the series is going to go forward once a week, so stay tuned for that, along with a bunch of other personal projects of mine following up. So, if you like just the Harry Potter segment, great. So I'm going to be doing the whole series, and if you want to check out my other stuff, the NBA things, and what I stream on Twitch, check that stuff too. So, without further ado, let's get started. Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. And now just a quick statement about the term Sorcerer's Stone. I'm pretty sure the release of the movie Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone for America was the Philosopher's Stone. And I never really searched up why that was. I feel like being a sorcerer and being a philosopher are completely different things. Now maybe because the Philosopher's Stone had sort of a historical myth context to it, they thought it would be a lot easier to, seduce American audiences to the movie by renaming it, but I really don't understand why they would do so. I feel like if I was a person who thought Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone wasn't alluring, changing sorcerers to philosophers wasn't gonna get me like a like an epiphany, like, oh my god, I should. I just don't believe in that. So it was pretty interesting by them, honestly, and then weird marketing ploy, but props to them. Alright, let's do chapter 1, The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive. I used to think it was private until book 7 came out, when I reread it. I realized I was pronouncing it wrong the whole time. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, and although he did have a very large mustache, Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences and spying on the neighbors. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. So I'm going to take a quick pause here, and I'm pretty sure that by the time that Lily and James die, spoilers, I guess. I mean, if you haven't read the Harry Potter series up until now, and this is sort of your first introduction, I apologize, although you find this out in the same chapter. And let me know down in the comments if I should have it spoiler free, but when Lily and James pass away, I think they're like 19 and 20, and considering Petunia is Lily's sister and they're around the same age, I'm pretty sure Lily's older maybe by like a year, that would make Petunia like 19 in this. And again, I may be totally wrong, but it's just something to think about, because I feel like Mr. Dursley, I always figured Mr. Dursley and Petunia being kind of the same age, but if he's like a director of a firm, he probably wouldn't be in his low 20s. I mean, maybe he had that position inherited. I don't want to go too deep in the in that whole thing. But yeah, it's just something weird to think about because I always expected them to be in their 40s and not closer to their 20s. But yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it is. Um, I mean, maybe I am wrong. Maybe there's a retcon somewhere down the line. But yeah, I always expected Mr. like Vernon uh, and Petunia to be in their like late 30s, early 40s. Because like when Harry is around his like 12-year-old self, I definitely expected them to be like 48, 49. Um, so just him being I don't think that's what it is. So him being a director at the age of like 20, that's pretty crazy, not gonna lie. Again, maybe completely wrong and they retconned it or just wrong in general, but it's just something weird to think about. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they haven't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended she didn't even have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as undursley-ish as if was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. Alright, yeah, I shouldn't really pause at every paragraph or else I'm never gonna get through this, but yeah, I mean, I don't know, it's I feel like I have known so many Dursleys throughout my life, not in the abusive parenthood type of way, but certainly the neighbor obsessed version of people. I remember when I went to, I think, high school, there was someone who would constantly mention what their neighbors were doing. And it's kind of an oddity for me. I don't think, I'm not judging people for being nosy, but it's like there are some certain people who are so obsessed with their image around people that they're not even friends with, aka neighbors. So it was always very jarring to me. Hearing them being that obsessed and that stalkerish to people that they don't really know. But yeah, no, it's, I'm pretty sure everybody listening to this probably knows, to some extent, a Dursley. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on a dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the walls. Little tyke, chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar, a cat reading a map, and for a second there, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he have been thinking of? Must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat, and it stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. and as he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about, people in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes, the get-ups you saw in young people. See, they must have retconned it, because I think canonically, if he's near the same age as Petunia, he'd be in his 20s. But I feel like if you're a 20-something-year-old, you wouldn't be like, young people. That's not a... I don't even think you'd say that in your 30s. Maybe in your 30s. I mean, I'm not there yet. I'm not close to being there yet. Thank the Lord, I still have a little bit of youth in me. But yeah, I don't... The idea of saying young people... that would imply that Mr. Dursley is definitely like late 30s, early 40s, just the vernacular of that. And yeah, maybe I'm just wrong. And maybe they did retcon it, but I'm pretty sure if going by Petunia's age, he should be in his 20s. Or maybe Petunia's like 20 and he's 31, 32, and they just have a 10 to 12 year difference, which no judgment, and it's just not the first thing you think about. He supposed this was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, again, reference to age, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him. But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yeah, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived in the Grunnings parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never even seen an owl, even at nighttime. Yeah, me neither. The irony being, my channel being called The Metropolitan Owl, my Twitch being Remburst, which is also a picture of an owl. I don't know, I view owls as really cool. I do like the wise, I almost said wise aesthetic. I'd say like, in myths and in literature, they're just viewed as very wise creatures. And I kind of like that. I do understand people thinking maybe it's a bit pretentious for me putting that as my icon with the implication that I consider myself wise, but yeah, I have never seen an owl in real life. I think I've seen one, and I certainly saw one in a zoo, or maybe not at a zoo, at one of those bird sanctuary things, but non-caged live, I think maybe once in my life. But yeah, no, I feel like if I was in Mr. Dursley's situation, I saw a crap ton of owls during the day. I know he's not right now, but I'd say the people in Mr. Dursley's company who's seeing these birds midday, I'd be freaking out. It's like, I think something post-apocalyptic's coming that way. I don't know what I'd think, it's a very bizarre situation that I really don't know how I'd react. Just seeing a creature that you have in your whole life and then all of a sudden a flurry, yeah, that's kind of wild. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. What type of bun do you think he's into? Is he like a cream bread man, a garlic bread man, or maybe something wholly unique? He seems to be he puts on a lot of airs, so I'm pretty sure he goes for something bougie. Um, what's bougie bread? What's a bougie bread? Yeah, I'm not sure what constitutes as a bougie bread. Maybe foie gras on toast. I don't know if you could go to a bakery and ask for that, though. That sounds like I mean, I don't know. I'm personally not from the UK. Maybe that's a decently readily available dish you can order. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the bakers. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut. Oh, okay, so he's a donut guy. See, I don't remember this, so even rereading the series, it's very fun. Clutching a large donut in a bag. Then he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped, dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers, as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, and snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache. Again, that's kind of weird to me. Out of all facial hair, I feel like if you ever have a character with a mustache, they're always stroking it. You know what I mean? It's not, I feel like once in a while you get and then he stroked his beard. But you never get like and he stroked his sideburns. It's always stroking his mustache, and it's usually a character trait for whoever has the mustache. It's a very bizarre thought. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son named Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. By the way, I apologize if my reading gets scuffed once in a while. Again, this is my first time doing it, so I might finagle over some words. Maybe I'll just edit it in post. There we go. Sorry, he grunted, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground, and on the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made passersby stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last, and even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he'd been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car. He hurried to his car and set off for home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. So, I feel like the way he says muggle, even muggles like yourself, if I was randomly in the street knocked into someone and someone said that, I'd honestly think they were saying a racial slur. Like, I wouldn't act upon it because I don't know what that term is, but I feel like if someone's like, even muggles like you, it's like, oh, okay, alright, okay, I guess we're going there. It's a new Korean slur that I haven't heard of. I'm Korean, by the way, if you didn't know. But yeah, that would be quite comedic. And also, I kind of enjoy them sort of sprinkling in Mr. Dursley hate already. He didn't approve of imagination. He yelled at 5 people, so it's not that I think they're painting Mr. Dursley as a blatant asshole, because it showed that he really loved his wife and his child, even though his child is a brat. Obviously, we know how this turns out in the future, but if we're just reading this, he just seems like a very stoic-minded businessman, who might be a little gruff, but doesn't seem very combative, and he doesn't seem like a net negative human being, like we'll see in the chapters coming. But yeah, no, I don't, I don't really see him as sort of that bad person as he eventually becomes a chapter later. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo," said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. That's grammatically correct. It's just something weird to read when you see 2 words just... Mrs. Dursley had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter, and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the latest report on the evening news. Yeah, see, Mr. Dursley just, again, doesn't seem like an argumentative person. He is trying to listen to his wife with all those other things going into his mind, and he remembers that Dudley learned a new word, won't, so he doesn't seem, again, albeit a gruff individual, he doesn't seem to be the blatant, and pardon my language here, asshole that you see him later in the series. So, you kind of wonder how that change came about, right? You kind of get a glimpse of it about, you get a glimpse of Petunia's hatred for her sister later in the series, especially I'd say book 7. But yeah, maybe that rubbed off on Mr. Dursley, but they sort of gave Petunia a little more emotional context with the Wizarding World, I think starting at book 5. Yeah, but with Mr. Dursley, you kind of just see him as this overarching asshole, while the other Dursleys definitely have a bit of an arc, if you could even call it that, because obviously the relationship between them and Harry has been turbulent, to say the least, and the interactions are overall minute in the books, obviously, because we want to get into the thick of things in Hogwarts, but yeah, Mrs. Dursley and Dudley kind of have their own self-reflective thing, by book 7. Maybe Petunia not so much as self-reflective, but you see her open up a little more to Harry at book 7, but Mr. Dursley just never has that. He just becomes a perpetual asshole. But again, this chapter just shows that he doesn't seem that way. He just seems like a gruff person who, yeah, eventually, like, I don't think he would have been, if you tell me this personality of a person, I wouldn't say, oh, and then he becomes an abusive asshole. Like, I don't think so. I don't think that's a 2-and-2 situation. So I wonder what really, geared him towards that situation and that personality trait with Harry. Yeah, I don't understand. And finally, whoops, I have to do the news reporter voice. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin, most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim? That's the only time I'll attempt a British accent here, I'm sorry. I apologize, I understand that there's a bunch of heavily accented individuals in this series, but for the sake of me not losing any UK fans, I'm just not gonna do that to myself. Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight. So is bonfire night one of those Thanksgiving situations? Because over here in America, we have something in November called Thanksgiving, which is essentially just to, give thanks to your family, to your friends. It's sort of a loving gesture. And it was a tradition ever since, I'm not sure ever since. Maybe it's been more commercialized. It definitely became more commercialized. If you've ever seen like the New York City, Manhattan Thanksgiving parade, I think Macy's runs that actually. I think it's literally Macy's Thanksgiving parade. But yeah, it was when the Pilgrims and the Native Americans in the Northeast got together and ate. Yay, Thanksgiving. But whether that's true or not, that's the quote unquote canon history of the United States. And I was wondering, because I don't know what bonfire night is. Is that something strictly from the UK, or is it European, or is it something they made up? Because something called bonfire night, it sounds like a made up. It literally sounds like a made up holiday for a book. Oh, are you guys going to bonfire night? That doesn't sound like it just doesn't sound like a holiday, Maybe it's my own ignorance. I don't know. I don't know what it would entail. Do you just burn things? But anyway. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? And as he expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? funny stuff on the news," Mr. Dursley mumbled. "Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today." "So," snapped Mrs. Dursley. "Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd." Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, "Their son, he'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he?" "I suppose so," said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?" "Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me." Oh yes," said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. "Yes, I quite agree." Here's something. So, Mr. Dursley knows Lily is a wizard/witch, right? So if he knows that, this makes me kind of question, there's this whole statute of secrecy that the wizarding world operates under. The muggles aren't supposed to know that wizards exist. That's kind of fact. Now, I do understand Mrs. Dursley knowing, because, again, that's her sister. You can't just, her sister leaves for Hogwarts 3/4 of a year, So there's no way Petunia just doesn't, her knowing makes sense to me, but I don't get why Mr. Dursley knows. I mean, Petunia probably told him, but I feel like if it's that easy to tell somebody about the wizarding world, wouldn't not only more people, but the majority of people know? Because, let's take it this way. Besides the purebloods, because their whole family's from wizards. Take Muggleborns, for instance, like Hermione, and even, Hermione, Lily, etc. So, right, their family knows. So, assuming that they are a 4-person household, which is customary, your parents know, who are both Muggles, and your sister knows, or your brother. So that's 3 Muggles to every Muggle born, on average, of course. And then, if they're not enforcing it, that means whoever your sibling was could tell their significant other, right? So now you're left with a situation where your parents, your sibling, and your sibling's boyfriend, girlfriend, husband, wife, then know about you being a wizard. So I feel like with that trickle-down effect, wouldn't there just be a butt ton of people in this world knowing about wizards? It's just something to think about. Again, maybe another retcon, because J.K. Rowling did add the statute of secrecy a little later. I mean, not super late into the series, it's still, a little bit. But, yeah, it's certainly a conundrum. Let's see. Oh, there we go. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept to the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eyes fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, nor when two owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. Actually, that's a good question. They don't like specifically reference it, but they said that it didn't quiver when two owls swooped overhead. Do cats and owls, what's the predator in that situation? Do they kind of just vibe alone? They see each other and they're just like, okay, it feels bad. or does one hunt the other? Genuine question, because, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It was certainly just a random idea that popped in my head, but yeah, I don't know what the predator would be in that situation. I'll take the cat. I like owls a lot, but I don't know actually, because owls have pretty big talons depending on which one you're talking about. I don't know. We'll leave it as a tie. Yeah. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching. Appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched, and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to be tucked into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. So I think his introduction is very interesting to me because J.K. Rowling does this thing, which a lot of authors, good and bad, do, which I personally really like, where they introduce characters that have usually one very distinctive trait. So in Vernon's case, it's his large, beefy mustache. Aunt Petunia she's very small and stringy, so there's that contrast. But with Albus, it's not just one trait that she focuses on. She gives you like a whole paragraph of what this man is, so it just by length gives you importance. And Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon, I guess. I don't know why that just sounds weirder. I don't know why I always say Petunia's name and then Mr. Dursley, but anyway. Yeah, like they're not small characters. I mean, I guess in the total scheme of things, they're just not in the series as often, but they're not exactly small characters, right? They do definitely play a part. At least in a lot of the conflict in the beginning of each book. Yeah, but they only get like a sentence. But with Albus Dumbledore, it's a whole paragraph. So just by the size of the text, this guy means something to the creator's scheme of the books. And obviously we know now how big of a part he plays. But yeah, it's very intriguing to me. The other thing that made me laugh is his blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles. So I always viewed that as crescent moon spectacles, and I always thought it would be perpendicular to his eyes, so it looked like inverted moons facing each other on top of his eyes, and it made for like really stupid looking glasses. And that's like what I thought he looked like all the way up until I think the end of the 5th book, I think up until the end of the 5th book, when they mention the half moon again, and then they have a little bit of a graphic for that chapter where you see it actually being half moon and parallel with his eyes, where you're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. not the weird crescent moon perpendicular glasses I was thinking of. But yeah, and the other cool thing is that they mention his nose being broken twice, so he's not this dainty old man. Like, how you just reading this text, you can tell that he's been through some thick. He's been through the thick of things. There we go, tongue twister. And I really enjoy that implication. And it's a lot of very show not tell moments in the Harry Potter series, and I really love that from authors. Like, show me, like this description of Albus shows me a lot. It's not like, oh, Albus Dumbledore fought two Dark Lords and won with his nose broken twice. Like, no, just show me. And JK does do a good job with that, especially when excuse me, a little bit tired here, especially when introducing new characters, etc. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in a street where everything from his name to his boots was unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something, but he did seem to realize he was being watched because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street, and for some reason, the sight of the cat seemed to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seemed to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a light pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp flickered in the darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer until the only lights left on the whole street were two tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, there we go, beady-eyed, they say this multiple times about her. Just again, hearkening back to my previous point about giving each character sort of their one defining trait. Even beady-eyed Mrs. Dursley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down on the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back inside his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy meeting you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses exactly the shape of the markings the cat had had around its eyes. Again, had. Not grammatically incorrect. It's just it's weird in text form. In the textual medium, putting two of the same words together always sounds weird. She too was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked distinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I have never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? Well, you could have been celebrating. Must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. Oh yes, everyone's celebrating all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a bit more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to notice something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I'll bet that was Daedalus Diggle. He never had much sense." "Well, you can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've had precious little to celebrate for 11 years. "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably. but there's no reason to lose our heads. People are being downright careless out on the streets in broad daylight, not even dressed in muggle clothes, swapping rumors. She threw a sharp, sideways glance at Dumbledore here, as though hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't, so she went on. A fine thing it would be if on the very day you-know-who seems to have disappeared at last, the muggles found out about us all. I suppose he really has gone, Dumbledore. It certainly seems so, said Dumbledore. We have much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop? A what? A lemon drop. They're kind of muggle sweet I'm rather fond of. No, thank you, said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. As I say, even if you-know-who has gone. So a very interesting thing here. We are introduced to two characters before the third. The first one, actually the first two is a bundled deal. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley clearly hate the Wizarding World. They were referencing it. Oh, if those people, if they were shown to be related to those people. So they hate the wizards. And Professor McGonagall mentioning, oh, they're not that stupid. There's a bit of condescension from both sides, but although it's not, there isn't any phrasing about Dumbledore, the muggle lover. It's nothing of the sort. He just eats a muggle candy. But I feel like that's a very interesting view, an interesting way of introducing, I guess, a very sympathetic character in terms of the fact that, like, he just seems to is sympathetic. I'd say is sympathetic, probably not sympathetic, but he obviously has some type of respect for Muggle culture, and this is it's obviously a microcosm, and but it's very nice to see this type of foreshadowing and the way they contrast, or JK contrasts the way he enjoys a lemon drop with the coldness of both Professor McGonagall and the Dursleys to the other person's, I wouldn't say race, but group. And it's very nice. It's a good introduction and a good character trait to introduce. It's not just that he likes candy. It's that he specifically likes muggle candy. And JK does a really good job with that and that type of foreshadowing. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the biggest flaw, in my opinion, with J.K. Rowling has never been the Harry Potter series. It's been post-Harry Potter series. Cursed Child was horrendous. I mean, I can't even... I don't like going... That's why I kind of paused there. I don't enjoy tearing down people's works, because no matter how bad the text... just writing something in its full form, it takes a while. But yeah, The Cursed Child was horrible, and the Fantastic Beasts series, the first one was very good, in my opinion. It got a lot of critical, a lot of critics were negative on it, but I personally thought it was very enjoyable, and yeah, I thought it was an enjoyable film, but the second one was definitely more on the line of atrocious than not. But regardless, yeah. Everything that J.K. Rowling ruined about Harry Potter was post the actual series, and I feel like the fandom has really gone through and kind of siphoned out what they view as canonical. It might be a bit unfair, because anything J.K. says is canon should be canon, as she is the main creator, but she seemed to forget a lot of things. So personally, I view the main 7 books and the next 2 movies as canon, and I really don't view The Cursed Child as such. Just the characters just weren't the characters. Yeah, it doesn't feel like a natural progression to the series. So. My dear Professor, sir, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years, I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort. Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unsticking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice. It all gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I've never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. Oh, I know you haven't, said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. But you're different. Everyone knows you're the only one you-know-who, all right, Voldemort was ever frightened of. You flatter me, said Dumbledore calmly. Voldemort had powers I will never have. Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. Oh, it's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs. Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, The owls are nothing next to the rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone's saying about why he's disappeared? About what finally stopped him? It seemed that Professor McGonagall had reached the point she was most anxious to discuss, the real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day, for neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed Dumbledore with such a piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whatever everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. What they're saying, she pressed on, is that last night, Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumors that Lily and James Potter are that they're dead. Dumbledore bowed his head. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James, I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill the Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy, and no one knows why or how, but they're saying that when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke. And that's why he's gone? Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true? Faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy. It's just astounding. Of all the things to stop him, but how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor McGonagall pulled out a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very odd watch. It had 12 hands but no numbers, and instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was him who told you I'd be here, by the way. That's one thing about the Wizarding World that I appreciated and didn't like, because they had pocket watches, and it's weird that, I mean, maybe this watch is very similar to the watch or the clock the Weasleys had in their home that showed where people were, but I don't know, something about this is kind of, it just seems way too exaggerated to be a clock, you know what I mean? Like, you might as well just give them a watch. They don't need to make everything wizardy, but maybe it has more functions. It's like a G-Shock, who knows? Yes, said Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family he has left. You can't mean the people who live here? cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us, and they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here. It's the best place for him, said Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter? Repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore, you think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He'll be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today was known as Harry Potter Day in the future. There will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glasses. It would be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can't you see how much better off he'll be growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly, as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid's bringing him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound had broken the silence around them. It grew steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorcycle fell out of the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing to do with the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man, and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. Long tangles of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lids, and his feet in their leather boots were like baby dolphins. I don't get that comparison. Baby dolphins as his feet. That's just a really weird image. Anyway, moving on. In his vast muscular arms, he was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, sounding relieved. At last. And where did you get that motorcycle? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. No problems, were there? No, sir. The house was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the muggles started swarming around. He fell asleep as he was flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet-black hair over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut. It was like a bolt of lightning. Is that where? Whispered Professor McGonagall. Yes, said Dumbledore. Yes, said Dumbledore. You'll have that scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it? Even if I could, I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself above my left knee that is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arms and turned towards the Dursleys' house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir? Asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy and whiskery kiss. Then suddenly, Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. "Shh!" hissed Professor McGonagall. "You'll wake the muggles." Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and burying his face in it. "But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with muggles. Yes, it's all very sad, but get a grip of yourself. Hagrid, or we'll be found," Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He lay Harry gently on the doorstep, took a letter out of his cloak, tucked it inside Harry's blankets, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. "Well," said Dumbledore finally, "that's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the celebrations." "Yeah," said Hagrid in a very muffled voice. "I best get this bike away. Good night, Professor McGonagall. Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his streaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorcycle and kicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off into the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked back down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out the silver put-outer. He clicked it once, and 12 balls of light sped back to their street lamps so that Privet Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out a tabby cat slinking around a corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blankets on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he murmured. He turned on his heel, and with a swoosh of his cloak, he was gone. A breeze ruffled the neat hedges of Privet Drive, which lay silent and tidy under the inky sky, the very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blankets without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's screams as she opened the front door to put out the milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being prodded and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment, people, meeting in secret all over the country, were holding up their glasses and saying in hushed voices, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." Thank you for joining me in this first chapter of a long series. I didn't think it right to add some commentary in the last few pages there. Not that I thought it would be sacrilegious, I just thought the pacing would be broken too much. If you noticed before, I was reading, actually probably not because I don't have the text up, but I was actually giving my commentary between certain paragraphs, etc. But this whole last few pages kind of flowed really well, and I didn't really want to break that pace. So forgive me if you missed my commentary in the last few pages there. Yeah, I think they personally speaking, I think they do a very good job of introducing the strife between muggles and wizards and vice versa, and how Dumbledore kind of walks that line. I do enjoy how we kind of get the personality traits of Petunia and Vernon, but more importantly, they don't seem like bad people. I know I mentioned this a lot earlier, but So it's interesting to see their immediate metamorphosis, albeit it's been like 12 years since this moment, but their metamorphosis into like a more hateable group of people. And it makes you kind of wonder why, and what type of animosity, I guess, Mrs. Dursley has for her sister, that she ends up taking it out on Harry. So there's a lot here, you know, good mystery, good context. One of the things that I don't agree with, however, is I thought Dumbledore leaving a note for them was a little eh. I thought it would be better if Dumbledore came in physically to meet with the Dursleys and explain to them the whole situation. Because someone might mention the statute of secrecy, which I just disagree with. He does it in the sixth book. He straight up just walks in the house, right? So, yeah, I feel like the Dursleys at least warrants a conversation because, you know, this, I mean, from a fiscal standpoint, right? Having another baby doesn't just mean like more work. I mean, it does, but it also means more money needs to be spent, right? So, like, I don't like doing this in too much of a logical perspective, but imagine all of a sudden you have a kid. Like, now all your finances have to be sort of revamped. You need to start allocating things differently, and it's a jarring process. So I feel like at the very least Dumbledore could have been physically there to sort of walk the Dursleys through it. Yeah. So I mean, besides that, it's just a fantastic a fantastic start to an amazing series. And it's not even a critique that I had right there. It's more of just it's just a personal opinion. Yeah, I think Dumbledore could have done a better job with that, as I mean, he's shown in the future. But regardless, thank you so much for starting this journey with me. This is going to be a really fun series to do. I can already see it being one of my more favorite endeavors to sort of cross over, and I'm glad you guys are here to start it off with me, and hopefully we, garner a following, so we can all discuss about Harry Potter and maybe other things too, and what series to get into in the future. So good day, good night, and see you later.